Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today we're exploring why Diep decides to leave with Nye to end the pressure once and for all. And the big question is, can James stop her before it's too late? If you enjoy the story, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. The morning air felt sharp, like the city was daring James to slow down. He didn't. He moved on exhaustion and instinct. Shirt half tucked, hair still damp, legs heavy, but mind locked on one truth. Diep was leaving today. The bus station hit him with noise and motion. Vendors called out, engines rumbled, people dragged luggage across the concrete. James pushed through the crowd, scanning faces, forcing himself to breathe. Stay calm. If you arrive like a storm, you'll push her farther away. Then he saw them. Diep stood near a row of plastic seats, a small bag in one hand and Nye tucked close to her side. Nye's backpack looked too big for her tiny frame. She leaned into Diep, sleepy and confused. Diep's face was composed, too composed. The calm of someone who cried in private and decided she couldn't afford more tears. James stopped a few steps away, chest rising and falling hard. He stepped closer. Diep. Diep's shoulders tightened. She turned slowly, like she'd rehearsed this moment and still hated it. James kept his voice steady. Where are you going? Diep smoothed Nie's hair. Somewhere quiet. Quiet from what? Her eyes met his, flat, tired, guarded. From pressure. From being pulled apart. James's gaze dropped to the bag. So, you're really doing this, he said softly. You're taking her and leaving. Diep didn't deny it. I have to. James held his hands open at his sides. You don't have to do it alone. Diep's mouth twitched into an almost smile. And what would you do? Stand in front of a bus? If I have to, James said. Diep's stare sharpened. James, don't. Nye looked up then, blinking, voice small. Uncle James? James crouched instantly. Hey, little star. Nye brightened for half a second, then hesitated when she felt the tension. Diep guided her away, gently. Nye, sweetheart, go sit over there for a minute, okay? Watch the buses. Nye nodded and walked to the seats, hugging her backpack tight. When she was far enough, Diep's voice dropped. Don't do this in front of her. James nodded quickly. Okay, then talk to me. Diep glanced at the departure board. The bus leaves soon. James heard it. The clock inside her head. I'm not here to drag you back, he said. I'm here because I love you. And I love her. We can figure this out without you disappearing. Diep's eyes narrowed. Figure it out. How? James paused. Every solution he wanted to say sounded like war, and war was exactly what Diep was trying to escape. He took a breath. Tell me what you need. Diep studied him, waiting for an explosion. When it didn't come, her voice quieted. I need you to stop, she said. Stop what? Stop trying to fight him like an enemy, Diep said, emotion trembling under her control. He's your father. You can hate what he's doing, but you can't turn your life into a courtroom. James's throat tightened. You mean the lawsuit? Diep nodded. Yes. If you sue him, she continued firmer, people will say you're unfilial. They'll say you destroyed your family for a woman. Even if you win, you'll lose something you can never get back. James's voice dropped. This isn't about what people say. It becomes about that, Diep insisted. He'll turn it into a spectacle. He'll make you look like the villain, and you'll carry it forever. James clenched his jaw. Anger rose, but he forced it down. And if I don't sue him, he said, he keeps controlling us. Diep's eyes shone, but she held steady. Then I remove myself. James froze. What? I'll take Nye away, Diep said, voice shaking but clear. I can accept leaving, but I can't accept watching you destroy your own family because of me. James stepped closer, voice tight. So you'll sacrifice us to protect his reputation? Diep flinched. I'm trying to protect you from regret. James exhaled sharply. Do you think I won't regret losing you? Diep softened for one heartbeat, then hardened again. I already regret everything, she whispered, but I can still choose what regret I can live with. The words landed like a quiet collapse. James realized she wasn't threatening anymore. She'd already accepted it. He swallowed hard. Is that your condition? Diep nodded. Yes. James stared at her. If I promise not to sue him, you stay? Diep looked away at the buses, then back at him. If you don't sue him, I will stay, Diep said. I'll try, but if you go to court, James, I leave today, with Nye. James felt the station noise fade. He forced himself to breathe. You're asking me to let him keep doing this, he said. I'm asking you not to destroy yourself, Diep replied. James glanced toward Nye. She pretended to watch the buses, but her eyes kept flicking back, scared one of them would vanish. He rubbed his face, thinking, then spoke again, calmer than he felt. Okay, he said. I won't sue him. Diep's eyes widened, relief and suspicion colliding. You mean it? James nodded once. I mean it. But his tone stayed firm. Not suing him doesn't mean I'm surrendering, he said. I'm not giving him a stage to paint me as unfilial. Diep searched his eyes. Then what are you going to do? James's voice stayed controlled, soft, but strong. I'm going to take away his leverage, James said. Quietly, legally, smart. A bus engine roared nearby. The departure board clicked. Nye stood and walked toward them, voice small. Are we going? Diep looked at Nye, then back at James, whispering, if you're saying this just to stop me, I will never forgive you. James held her gaze. Trust me for one day. Diep's lips parted, ready to argue, ready to run. Then a familiar voice cut the fiskani. Nah, we're you home with the station noise, smooth and calm. James went rigid. He turned slowly. Mr. Fat stood a few meters away, watching with a quiet smile. Like he'd arrived exactly on time, Mr. Fat's figure appeared at the edge of the crowd, just long enough for James to catch that familiar posture, that calm that didn't belong in a bus station. Then he was gone, swallowed by moving bodies, rolling suitcases, and the station's noise. Like a warning, not a confrontation. James didn't chase him. Not now. He turned back to Diep and forced his breathing to slow. If anger took the wheel, he'd lose her in one heartbeat. Diep was staring at him, eyes tight with fear and disbelief. You saw him? James nodded once. I did. Diep's fingers clenched around Nye's backpack strap. Then we have to go. James stepped in front of her, not blocking the exit, not trapping her, just placing himself between her panic and a decision she'd regret the second the bus doors closed. Diep, he said gently, look at me. Not the buses, not the schedule. Me. Her gaze flickered to his face, then away. Her control was slipping, and she hated that he could see it. Nye stood beside Diep, small and quiet, sensing everything. James crouched down again, softening his voice. Hey, little star, he told Nye. Can you do me a favor? Count the red buses for me. Tell me how many you see. And when you finish, come whisper the number, okay? Nye blinked, then nodded like she'd been given a mission. She turned toward the lanes, raising tiny fingers as she counted silently. That bought them a pocket of privacy. Diep's voice dropped. You promised. You said you won't sue him. I won't, James said immediately. Her eyes narrowed. You said it too easily. That's what scares me. James didn't flinch. Because suing him is loud. It turns our lives into a public battle. It gives him a stage. You were right about that. Diep's lips pressed together. Belief had burned her before. So, what are you planning? She asked. James took a breath. I'm planning to protect you, he said, without destroying my family. Diep gave a brittle laugh. Those two things don't go together. They can, James replied, steady, if we stop playing his game. And how do we do that? Diep asked, anger and exhaustion mixing. James lowered his voice. By taking away what he uses to control us. Quietly. Diep searched his face. That sounds like fighting. It's not a fight, James said. It's a lock on the door, a boundary he can't step over without consequences. Diep's shoulders tensed. What consequences? Legal ones, James said. But not a lawsuit, not a public war. Diep's expression tightened. James, listen, he cut in gently. If I sue him, he becomes the victim in everyone's eyes. If I don't, he thinks he owns me. So we do something in the middle. Soft but strong. Diep's breathing quickened. Soft but strong. No shouting, James said. No dramatic moves. Just smart choices he can't twist. Diep looked down, fighting tears. And what am I supposed to do? You take her somewhere safe for a few days, James said. Not to run forever, just to breathe. Somewhere he can't predict. Diep shook her head. That's still running. It's space, James insisted. You're not leaving me. You're giving me room to put protections in place without you two in the crossfire. Diep's jaw trembled. You always think you can fix everything. I can't, James admitted. But I can stop this from getting worse. Diep's eyes lifted, exhausted. You don't understand how tired I am. I do, he said quietly. I'm tired too. Tired of choosing. Tired of paying for love with fear. Her walls shook. James stayed calm. I'm more tired of watching you carry this alone, he added. You shouldn't have to plan your whole life around someone else's control. Diep's voice turned sharp. Then don't ask me to stay. I'm not asking blindly, James said. I'm asking with conditions. Your conditions. That landed. Diep hesitated. You want the pressure to stop, James said. I want the same. So, we stop the pressure, not us. Diep swallowed. How? First, James said, I keep my promise. No lawsuit. Diep watched him. Second, he continued, I document everything quietly, only for protection. Third, I cut off the channels he uses. Money, access, information. Diep stared, the plan forming. And you think he'll accept that? No, James said. He'll push harder at first. Fear flashed. Then why do it? Because after the push comes the choice, James said. He either stops or he exposes himself by escalating. And if he escalates, we're prepared. Diep looked toward Nye, still counting with serious eyes. I can't risk her. Neither can I, James said. Diep's voice cracked. What if he never stops? Then we make sure he can't touch us without consequences, James replied. Quiet ones. No stage. And if he forces you to choose again? Diep whispered. James stepped closer, steady. Then I choose you. But I choose you in a way that doesn't destroy me later. A tear slid down Diep's cheek. I don't want you to hate your father because of me, she whispered. This isn't hate, James said. It's limits. Nye turned back, eyes bright. Uncle James, I saw 3 red buses. James smiled. Good job. Nye walked closer, holding up 3 fingers. Are we going now? Diep's arm wrapped protectively around Nye's shoulders. She looked at her child, then back at James. Run, or trust. Diep swallowed. I stay, she said softly. But you do it your way. Quiet. No lawsuit. James nodded. Yes. And if I sense revenge, Diep began. I stop, James said immediately. You call it, I stop. Diep studied him, then brushed Nye's hair back, fragile softness returning. Okay, Diep whispered. James exhaled slowly and reached out, not to grab, just to touch Diep's hand lightly, asking permission. Diep let him. And in the middle of the station, engines roaring, strangers rushing past, James made a quiet promise with his whole posture. No more running.
James lao đến bến xe trong trạng thái kiệt sức nhưng vẫn cố giữ bình tĩnh để nói chuyện với Diệp. Anh bắt gặp Diệp đang ôm Nhi và chuẩn bị rời đi để trốn khỏi áp lực bủa vây. James không ép buộc mà khéo léo tạo khoảng riêng, nhờ Nhi đi đếm xe buýt để hai người có thể nói chuyện. Diệp đưa ra điều kiện để dứt khoát James không được kiện cha vì cô sợ anh bị mang tiếng bất hiếu và tự tay phá nát gia đình mình. Nếu James vẫn kiện, Diệp sẽ rời đi ngay trong ngày cùng Nhi. James chấp nhận không kiện, nhưng khẳng định anh không đầu hàng, sẽ dùng cách mềm nhưng mạnh để đặt ranh giới, cắt đứt đòn bẩy để kiểm soát và âm thầm bảo vệ mẹ con Diệp.